It is April 28, 1945, 9 o'clock at night. 55 feet beneath the ruined garden of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the Second World War is no longer a sound you hear. It is a vibration you feel in your teeth. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers are systematically dismantling the city above, block by block. Their artillery lands with such relentless rhythm that the bunker registers it like a dull, recurring earthquake, shaking dry cement dust from the low ceilings every few minutes. The air down here is foul. It is claustrophobic and deeply sour. The ventilation system merely pushes around the same stale cocktail of damp concrete, unwashed wool uniforms, raw diesel exhaust from the generators, and sweat. Underneath it all lingers the faint, bitter chemical trace of prussic acid. They just tested a cyanide capsule on the household dog, Blondie, to make sure the poison actually works. Paranoia has eaten through the last scraps of trust. They don't even believe their own doctors anymore. In a cramped, low-ceilinged briefing room, a valet named Heinz Ling steps forward. He hands over a single sheet of paper. It is a translated summary from a foreign radio broadcast intercepted earlier that evening by the propaganda ministry. The man reading it is physically wrecked. Adolf Hitler is 56 years old, but he looks 20 years older. His left arm trembles so violently he has to pin it against his side. His posture has collapsed completely inward. His eyes are fogged by the daily staggering regimen of narcotics administered by his personal physician, a cocktail of opiates, cocaine drops, methamphetamine, and animal hormones designed to keep him walking and talking. But as he reads the words on the paper, the chemical haze suddenly clears. Heinrich Himmler, the supreme architect of the SS, the engineer of the terror state, the man whose personal motto is literally, "My honor is loyalty," has secretly contacted the Western Allies. Himmler has offered to negotiate a surrender. This is the exact moment the machine breaks. It breaks not because of a battlefield defeat, not because of an assassination plot. It shatters because the core operating principle of the entire regime, absolute, unquestioning, personal loyalty to one man, has just cracked at the very top. Inside this concrete tomb, the generals and bureaucrats around him are not mourning a lost war. They stopped doing that months ago. Right now, they are doing arithmetic. They are doing lifeboat calculations. In a closed political economy where proximity to power is the only currency that matters, the exchange rate has just violently collapsed to zero. If you want to understand why the most lethal political apparatus of the 20th century turned on itself in its final hours, you cannot start on the Eastern Front. You cannot start with tank battles or military strategy. You have to start with paperwork, with organizational charts. You have to look at how this system was designed long before there was ever a bunker. So, we need to rewind. Germany in the 1920s was not a country primed for tyranny. It was a country primed for exhaustion. The Weimar Republic was a progressive democracy on paper, but in practice it was paralyzed. The trauma of the First World War bled directly into the streets. You have to imagine what hyperinflation actually does to a society's psychology. It is not just that things get expensive. It is the complete obliteration of reality. When a loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks, and people are burning wheelbarrows full of cash because the paper is cheaper than firewood, all faith in institutions evaporates. You had private street militias fighting running gun battles in Munich and Berlin. Parliament could barely form stable governments, let alone solve the economic freefall. The German public did not wake up one day craving a bloodthirsty dictatorship. They craved silence. They wanted order. They wanted relief from the grinding, terrifying noise of a state that could no longer protect them or provide for them. Most people looked at Adolf Hitler in these early years and saw exactly what he looked like. A fringe fanatic screaming in beer halls. The traditional conservative elites who eventually helped appoint him chancellor in January 1933 did not respect him. They thought they were hiring a loud, useful populist mascot. Men like Franz von Papen actually believed they could box him into a corner, use his mob of supporters to crush the communists, and control the government from behind the scenes. Papen famously boasted that within 2 months, they would have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he would squeak. It was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in human history. Hitler understood something the old Prussian aristocrats completely missed. Power does not live in constitutions. It does not live in fancy titles, and it certainly does not live in old money. Power lives in the legal control of violence. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave him the exact opportunity he needed. When the Parliament building burned down, Hitler did not launch a military coup. He did something far more insidious. He used the law. The emergency decree that followed suspended civil liberties, legalized indefinite detention, and handed the police the ability to arrest anyone without charge. It was not a revolution of guns. It was a revolution of rubber stamps. Repression became the law of the land with a single signature from the aging President Hindenburg. But to secure that absolute power permanently, Hitler had to eliminate his rivals, even the ones wearing his own uniform. During the Night of the Long Knives in the summer of 1934, he purged the leadership of his own paramilitary force, the SA. He used the ensuing chaos of that weekend to murder political enemies across the spectrum, journalists, conservative politicians, old rivals from the 1920s. And then he did something breathtakingly cynical. He pushed through a law retroactively declaring the weekend of mass murder an act of necessary state defense. Think about that. Murder legalized after the fact. Once he had a monopoly on violence, he did something incredibly strange. He did not dismantle the traditional German state. He didn't fire all the old judges or close down the civil ministries. He cloned them. For every traditional government ministry, he created a parallel Nazi party structure with the exact same job and overlapping authority. Jurisdictions collided constantly. Responsibilities blurred. You had the regular army, but you also had the SS. You had the foreign ministry, but you also had the party's own foreign policy office. His top lieutenants, Hermann Göring, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, Martin Bormann, hated each other. They spent more time fighting each other for resources and jurisdiction than they did fighting the Allies. From an administrative perspective, it was a wildly inefficient, chaotic mess for governing a modern industrial nation. But it was absolutely perfect for keeping one man in charge. The British historian Ian Kershaw famously called this concept working toward the Führer. Hitler hated paperwork. He rarely woke up early, despised reading long policy documents, and almost never issued clear, written domestic orders. Instead, he would give vague, sweeping speeches about his worldview. His subordinates were forced to compete with one another to anticipate his wishes. If you wanted budget money or power or the Führer's ear, you had to prove you were the most radical, the most uncompromising, the most ruthless. This is the key to understanding the sheer scale of Nazi atrocities. The horror wasn't just handed down from the top, it boiled up from the middle. Subordinates radicalized themselves to win office politics. Atrocity became decentralized. Initiative became the ultimate loyalty test. As long as Germany was winning the war, this chaotic, predatory system paid for itself. The plunder of Europe covered up the catastrophic dysfunction of the Nazi administration. Victory masked the rot. But this specific type of government had a fatal design flaw. It had no reverse gear. When the German Sixth Army was annihilated at Stalingrad in 1943, when the Allies landed at Normandy in 1944, when the borders finally started shrinking, the system simply could not process defeat. Why? Because admitting failure meant admitting the leader made a mistake. And if the leader made a mistake, the entire ideological foundation of the state crumbled. The myth of the infallible genius was the only thing holding the competing factions together. So the machine did the only thing it knew how to do when backed into a corner. It escalated. On March 19, 1945, with Soviet troops on German soil and the Americans crossing the Rhine, Hitler issued the Nero Decree. It was an order to systematically destroy whatever was left of Germany's infrastructure. Bridges, power plants, water treatment facilities, rail lines, factories. The logic was pure social Darwinism. If the war was lost, Hitler reasoned, the German people had proven themselves weaker than the enemy in the East. Therefore, they did not deserve to survive the defeat. The good Germans were already dead on the battlefield. This was the exact moment the unwritten contract broke. For 12 years, the inner circle had given him their total obedience in exchange for immense power, stolen wealth, and privilege. Now he was demanding a national suicide pact. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, later claimed in his memoirs that he traveled frantically across Germany, quietly persuading local officials and army commanders to ignore the demolition orders. We should take Speer's post-war claims of heroism with a heavy grain of salt. He was desperately trying to save his own neck from the hangman. But the broader point stands. Key figures in the regime began quietly, covertly resisting the leader they still publicly worshipped. The spell was breaking. The lifeboat calculations had begun. Which brings us back down into the bunker. By late April, the daily military briefings in that claustrophobic conference room have devolved into ritualized fantasy. The psychological detachment from reality is hard to wrap your head around. You have Soviet tanks just a few blocks away, methodically reducing the government district to rubble. Down below, Hitler is hunched over a map table, confidently ordering counterattacks by divisions that no longer exist. He moves pencils around the map, waiting for a massive relief force under SS General Felix Steiner to strike the Soviet flank. Steiner's army is a ghost. It consists of exhausted teenagers, old men, and shattered remnants of infantry. They have no tanks, no air cover, and barely any ammunition. The attack never happens. Nobody in the room wants to be the one to tell the dictator that the map is a lie. The bureaucracy is functioning exactly as designed to the very bitter end. It is insulating the leader from the real world. But outside Berlin, the surviving elite face a massive logistical problem. They know the war is over. They know they need to make a deal, but they can't overthrow him. Their entire authority, their ranks, their power to command the troops, it is all legally derived directly from him. If he dies violently in a coup, they immediately risk being executed as traitors by rival factions within the SS or the military. They need him to die, yes, but they need him to die in a way that perfectly preserves the legal chain of command. On April 23, Hermann Göring sends a radio telegram from the safety of an Alpine estate in Bavaria. Göring is the legally designated successor, named by Hitler himself in a decree years earlier. The message is cautiously worded, heavily couched in bureaucratic deference. Göring essentially asks, "Since you are trapped in Berlin and cut off from the rest of the country, do I assume leadership of the Reich? If I do not hear back from you by 10 p.m., I will assume you are incapacitated and take control." Martin Bormann, the ruthless head of the party chancellery who has spent his entire career isolating Hitler from everyone else, intercepts the message. Bormann does not present the telegram to Hitler as a rational continuity of government plan. He presents it as an aggressive, treasonous ultimatum. He spins it beautifully. Hitler explodes in a fit of absolute rage. He strips Göring of all his titles, ejects him from the Nazi Party, and orders the SS to arrest him for high treason. Even now, with the roof literally caving in under artillery fire, Martin Bormann wins the office politics knife fight. But the real betrayal, the one that breaks Hitler completely, happens far away in the north. Heinrich Himmler has been cut off from Hitler's intoxicating personal presence for weeks. Left to his own devices, Himmler begins imagining a completely delusional post-war role for himself. He actually convinces himself that the Americans and the British are going to realize the true enemy is Soviet communism. And when they do, they are going to need him and his SS to maintain order and fight Stalin. Through Swedish intermediaries, Himmler attempts to open back-channel surrender negotiations with the Western Allies. And that brings us back to the night of April 28, the piece of paper in Hitler's trembling hands. The realization that the most loyal servant, the man who built the extermination camps, is trying to sell him out. Hitler's paranoia demands blood. It demands a purge. But his entire jurisdiction is now reduced to a few hundred square yards of damp concrete. He cannot reach Himmler. He cannot reach Göring. So he grabs the closest target available. Hermann Fegelein is Himmler's liaison officer in the bunker. He also happens to be married to Eva Braun's sister. Fegelein had quietly slipped out of the bunker a day earlier, realizing the end was near. The SS find him in his Berlin apartment, dressed in civilian clothes, packing bags with cash, ready to run. They drag him back down into the bunker. Hitler has him hastily court-martialed, dragged upstairs into the rubble of the Chancellery garden, and shot in the back. It is a miniature, pathetic purge, a fallen dictator reenacting the grand political terrors of the 1930s on the scale of an empty parking lot. With all avenues of physical violence finally exhausted, the dictator retreats to the only domain he still truly controls: paperwork. In the early hours of April 29, Hitler dictates his last will and political testament. It is a staggering document to read. There is no grand reflection, no remorse. It reads exactly like an administrative document written by a bitter middle manager shifting the blame for a failed quarterly report. The army generals failed him. The German people were too weak and failed him. Himmler and Göring betrayed him. He accepts absolutely zero responsibility for the destruction of Europe. Instead, he spends his final hours meticulously reorganizing an imaginary government on paper. He strips Himmler and Göring of their rights. He appoints Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as the new president. He makes Joseph Goebbels the new chancellor. Even at the absolute end of the line, with the walls shaking and the empire reduced to ashes, he is still moving bureaucratic pieces on a board that no longer exists. On April 30, just after 3:30 in the afternoon, he and his new wife Eva Braun enter his private study and close the heavy steel door. Minutes later, a single gunshot is heard. When the aides open the door, they find them both dead. Braun took the cyanide. Hitler bit a capsule and shot himself in the right temple simultaneously. The final order of the 1,000-year regime is entirely logistical. The surviving staff carry the bodies wrapped in blankets up the stairs, lay them in a shallow shell crater in the ruined garden, pour a few dozen liters of rationed gasoline over them, and strike a match. You would think that would be the end of the machine. The creator is dead. The capital is fallen. It isn't. Joseph Goebbels attempts to function as chancellor for a single pathetic day. He tries to open negotiations with the Soviet commanders. The Soviets tell him they will only accept unconditional surrender. Recognizing there is no place for him in the new world, Goebbels and his wife murder their 6 children with cyanide before killing themselves in the garden. Martin Bormann dies trying to break out of the city through the Soviet lines, his body rotting unrecognized in the mud for decades. But the rest of them? The surviving mid-level bureaucrats, the army generals, the industrialists who built the tanks and utilized the slave labor. They go back to work, and they begin a project that proves far more enduring than the bunker. They rewrite the story. As the dust settles and the Cold War freezes over Europe, the West suddenly needs West Germany to be strong. They need an army to face the Soviets. So the survivors build a convenient myth. It becomes known as the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The surviving generals and civil servants write memoirs. They give interviews to American historians. They meticulously separate the traditional German establishment from the crimes of the regime. They place the entire moral weight of the Holocaust, the war of annihilation, and the sheer incompetence of the strategy onto the shoulders of one dead man and a handful of fanatical SS thugs. We were just following orders, they argued. We were just honorable soldiers fighting for our country. We didn't know about the camps. Hitler ruined everything. It was a lie, of course. The regular army was neck-deep in the atrocities on the Eastern Front. The civil ministries organized the trains that went to Auschwitz. The industrialists requested the slave labor. But it was a lie the world desperately wanted to believe. And because it was written on official letterheads by men in neat suits, it became the accepted history for decades. The dictator burned in a shell crater in that garden. But the bureaucratic detachment that made the horror possible, the men who knew how to push the paper, write the memos, and look the other way, the machine simply changed uniforms and walked right out of the ashes.